Hi, my name is Janet Singer, and I'm the author of Overcoming OCD, A Journey to Recovery. I'm here at the Southborough Library tonight and excited to talk about how my book came to be, what OCD really is, and hopefully take lots of questions from the audience. So relax and enjoy the show. Hi everybody, my name is Janet Singer, and I'm the author of Overcoming OCD, A Journey to Recovery. Happy to be here tonight. What I thought I would do tonight is give a brief description of what OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is, talk about how my book came to be. I'll do a reading from the book and then take any questions that people might have. So first of all, what is obsessive compulsive disorder? OCD is such a misrepresented and misunderstood disorder. The media portrays those with OCD as cute and quirky and fanatically neat and desperately afraid of germs, and that really isn't the whole story, and sometimes not any part of the story of what OCD really is. As its name suggests, OCD involves both obsessions and compulsions that by definition significantly impact the quality of life of the person suffering from it. So what are obsessions? Obsessions are thoughts or images that recur and feel outside of the person's control. They're usually quite vivid. Those with OCD do not want to have these thoughts and find them very upsetting. In the majority of cases, people with OCD realize their obsessions don't make any sense, but the feelings, and they realize the obsessions aren't real, but the feelings that the obsessions evoke are very real. So things like fear, disgust, doubt, or a feeling that things have to be done a certain way overtake the person with OCD. In the context of OCD, obsessions are very time-consuming and get in the way of the person living the life that they want to. So it might be easy to understand by giving an example. Let's take the example of somebody with obsessive-compulsive disorder who has an obsession of hitting somebody while they're driving a car. This obsession is actually quite common in those with OCD. And it's so common that it has a name. It's called hit-and-run OCD. So somebody with OCD has this obsession that they're going to hit somebody while they're driving. Now, people with OCD are rational people. They know that if they don't see anybody in the road, then really, chances are you haven't hit anybody. But the thing with OCD is you can always trump it by asking the question, but are you sure? People with OCD need that certainty that they haven't done what they're obsessing about. So you're driving along, you don't see anybody, but you did go over this little bump in the road, and you keep driving, you think, oh, you know, maybe that really was a person. You rationally know that the chances are nil that could happen, but you also can ask the question, but are you really sure? And OCD feeds on doubt and uncertainty. So that's an example of an obsession. And because they can't be 100% sure that they didn't hit someone, they become obsessed with the fact that maybe they did. So another confusing thing about OCD is the fact that the terms obsessing and obsession are common terms in our everyday language. So you might hear somebody say, oh, I'm just obsessed with this, with this new song on the radio. And so while that might not be an improper use of the word, it's different than OCD. This we're talking about an interest that is actually pleasurable as opposed to OCD, the obsessions in OCD, which are never wanted or pleasurable. And these types of obsessions don't get in the way of your life. You might be obsessed over a song on the radio, but you can still get up in the morning, you can go to work, you can shower, you can go about your day without OCD interfering with your life. Even if you have obsessions that are more serious or more typical of what you might think of with OCD, for example, worrying about getting sick, or worrying about a loved one's safety, or wondering if a mistake might end in that you made might end in some kind of catastrophe, this doesn't necessarily mean that you suffer from OCD. Many of us worry, we have these types of thoughts, and they might stay with us for a little while or a few minutes or however long, but then we can put them aside and get on with our lives. People with OCD can't do that. They can't close that loop, and the obsession just builds and builds and builds, triggers extreme anxiety, and it overtakes your life, So that's kind of in a nutshell what obsessions are in relation to OCD. The next part of OCD are compulsions. That's the second part of obsessive compulsive disorder. Compulsions are repetitive behaviors or thoughts that a person uses with the intention of neutralizing, counteracting, or making the obsessions go away. It's human nature not to want to feel discomfort or fear or anxiety. And people with OCD realize that it's only a temporary solution. They realize that these rituals that they're doing, or compulsions, they're pretty much the same thing, make no sense, but they can't stop. They can't help it. And that, to me, is one of the most agonizing things about OCD, is that people with the disorder are totally rational. They know what's going on is making no sense, but they can't control it. I think it would be almost be better if you didn't realize, what was going on. So compulsions, as with obsessions, are time-consuming. They have to be at least over an hour a day for the definition of OCD to fit, and they also get in the way of your life, of important activities, your values, whatever you want to be doing in life. You can't do it because you're doing your compulsions. So getting back to the example of someone who has hit-and-run OCD, they've gone over this little bump and they're thinking, no, it's not a person, I didn't hit anyone, but they are compelled to perform compulsions. So one of the most common compulsions in this type of OCD is turning around, going back to the spot where you went over the bump, and making sure you didn't hit anybody. So the person with OCD is going to drive back and to the spot where they think they went over a bump, and they're going to look and they're going to see there's nobody there. Good. The anxiety goes away, and you drive off. 2 minutes later, it's like, well, I didn't really look everywhere. I didn't look, by the sidewalk. Maybe there's a person there and I missed it. And so they're compelled to go back again. And there are people with OCD who have done this for hours and hours and hours, and it's just a loop. It's just the way the brain is working. They can't feel satisfied that they haven't hit somebody. Another type of compulsion with this hit-and-run OCD might be to call every hospital you can think of in the area to see if someone's been brought in that was just hit by a car, or to watch the news compulsively to see if there's a story about somebody who hit and ran. So you can see that just from this one example how OCD can just take over somebody's life. So in my mind, there's only one good thing about OCD, and that's the fact that it is treatable. The frontline psychological approach, as recommended by the American Psychological Association, is a type of cognitive behavioral therapy known as exposure and response prevention. Its premise is simple. The OCD sufferer faces his or her fears, that's the exposure, and refrains from engaging in any compulsions. That's the response prevention. Sometimes it's called ritual prevention. So going back briefly to our friend with hit-and-run OCD, when this person is in treatment, he or she would need to drive on these roads that they've been avoiding because of what I described happening, this loop of them having to go back and forth. They would need to drive back on these roads, and when they get the feeling that, oh, I think I might have hit someone, they need to keep going. They need to, and this is the response prevention. They have to prevent themselves from doing the compulsions. So you can't go back and look, and you can't call every hospital, and you can't watch the news. And this, of course, is going to cause intense anxiety in the OCD sufferer. This is actually part of the therapy. and the person needs to basically just sit with the anxiety and then realize, as it always, always does, the anxiety will subside. When you're first starting treatment, you know, it could take a really long time to subside, and then it gets better and better. And the treatment also starts off gradually, so you know, there's all these extreme shows on TV of people with OCD, you know, being forced to lick toilet seats and things like that. It's never like that. It's done in a way that the OCD sufferer starts out with things that he or she feels they can tackle, and then they work their way up. That's assuming they have a good therapist. So you think, well, what's the problem? You've got this disorder, and you've got this treatment that does work, but it's not that simple. The biggest problem with ERP therapy, this exposure and response prevention therapy, is that it's not widely used. Therapists either don't know about it, or they choose not to use it or learn about it because it does involve training on their part. And this is just so unacceptable. To me, it's like having a certain type of cancer that has a specific treatment that will target the tumor, going to your oncologist and having him or her saying, yeah, that's the treatment, but you know what, we're going to try this, what I like to do instead. I mean, it's just, it makes no sense, and it's wrong. So those with OCD finally muster the courage to get a diagnosis and seek treatment, and so often they get this treatment that doesn't help them because it's not ERP therapy, or even worse, there's things like talk therapy that actually make OCD worse. So my goal through my book and my blog has always been to spread the word that OCD, no matter how severe, is treatable, and that exposure and response prevention therapy is the frontline treatment for the disorder. So that's basically what OCD is, and kind of the broad picture of what I advocate for. So now I thought I would just give a brief history of how my book evolved, came to be, and I'll do a short reading, and then if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So my son Dan has OCD, and when it was at its worst, this was beginning in 2008, I started keeping a journal. It was therapeutic for me, and it also helped me make sense, what little sense I could, of what was actually happening to him. Our family had been thrown into a world that we knew nothing about, and writing things down helped me keep track of medications and doctors and theories and opinions and appointments and just everything. Before I knew it, I had filled up an entire notebook. My friend Mark, who is an integral part of the book, encouraged me to think about writing a book, even though at that point we really had no idea what the ending would be. I obviously just was desperate for a happy ending, but we didn't know. So over the next couple of years, I just filled up more notebooks with the same type of information, just what our family was going through. And I filled up these notebooks as we were living the story that's now in the book. At times, I just felt so alone, like how could anybody understand what we were going through? But at other times, I thought, you know, we're just a regular family. There was nothing unusual about my family. We didn't have huge skeletons in our closet or anything. And I thought, you know, if we're going through this, chances are other people are too. But nobody seemed to be talking about it. So I started to talk. First to my close friends, which quickly led to friends having friends that have had children with OCD, and would I think about talking to them on the phone. At that point, thankfully, my son was doing very well, and I was happy to talk to anybody. And through these phone calls, I learned that what these parents, mostly moms that I spoke to, what these parents wanted to hear from me was not so much my opinion on certain doctors or therapies or medications, but really just that their child would be okay. They wanted hope. And so I helped I gave them that hope, and the only way that I knew how was basically by telling our story. I reassured them that, yes, our son had OCD so severe that he couldn't even eat. He had barely been functioning, and yes, he recovered. He was back in college at the time, medication-free, and doing really well. I could sense the relief through the telephone as his parents took in everything I was saying. So while I knew it was helpful to share my son's story, and I was always willing to speak to these various referrals, my advocacy pretty much ended there. Until OCD Awareness Week in October 2010, I was I was watching online. They were live streaming some events every year in October is an OCD Awareness Week, and there was very brave, courageous people with OCD who stood up and talked about their situations and their journeys. And at the same time this was happening, there was a chat room open where people could connect with each other. I had never done anything like this in my life before, but I just decided to jump in. So at one point during the chat, I connected with a distraught young woman who had been undergoing therapy for OCD for a long time, actually years, but her OCD was getting worse, not better. Is the ERP therapy too difficult for you? I typed. ERP therapy, she typed back, what's that? And that was, for me, was my light bulb moment, because up until that time, I always thought that our family had had bad luck, because when you would see in the book that we had a lot of mistreatment before we learned what the right treatment was and Dan got the right therapy. But I just thought that was us. I didn't realize that we actually had it easy, because on average, from the time it takes to get a diagnosis and the right treatment, on average, is 14 to 17 years for people with OCD. I mean, that's just crazy. So these were all things that I was just learning, that all these people didn't know about ERP therapy, therapists didn't know about ERP therapy, and it just boggled my mind. So it was at that point that I realized, okay, I really want to write this book. And so I really wanted to write the book, but even then I thought, well, it's going to be years before I write this hypothetical book that may or may not be published, and how can I get the word out now before this book even happens? And that's how my blog started. I decided to start a blog at that point, because that was obviously instantaneous. I didn't know anything about blogging. I had never even read a blog, but I did start a blog, and that took off quickly, which only showed me that there's so many people out there that wanted this information and that were suffering. And I've been blogging for 5 years now, and the blog reaches 167 countries, and it's become very important part of my advocacy, and hopefully helps people. And so through the blog, I have also had a lot of encouragement of people saying, you've got to write a book, you've got to write a book. And so I continued writing at that time. It was kind of the same time I'm doing the blog, I'm also working on the book. So I finished my memoir, and I was pleased. You know, I think it told the story, it gave people hope, but I felt that it needed a little bit more. It needed more concrete information about OCD. So it was around this time that Seth Gillihan, who's a clinical psychologist, happened to comment on a blog post that I wrote, and I liked what he said. He really got OCD, and he knew about the right treatment, and was in private practice himself, and also teaching at UPenn. And one thing kind of led to another with him. I invited him to do a guest post, and we started talking about my book, and then I thought, you know, he would be a great addition to the book. So I asked him if he would be interested in writing the text boxes, which basically give the clinical information, I wrote the story, and Seth wrote the details about actual facts about OCD and all kinds of things that come up with it. And so it was a process. He read my proposal, he read my drafts, and we were really in sync. you know, we hadn't even met, and we collaborated, and it was a wonderful collaboration, and we were able to get the book published. So that's really how the book came to be, and it's here now. It was published at the end of January. So what I would like to do now is just do a reading from the book. This is from chapter 3. I had just flown down to be with my son at college. He was 1,500 miles from home. We knew things weren't well, but we really didn't know what was going on with him. We knew he had OCD, but you know, he had hidden a lot of things from us, and we just didn't know how bad off he was. So when I arrived to him, he was barely functioning. He hadn't eaten in a week. So this is from chapter 3. It's almost 6 o'clock, Dan. Let's get going. By the look on his face, you'd think I told him he was about to face a firing squad. We made our arduous way down to the car and drove to a restaurant. Why don't you come in and pick out what you want, I suggested. All my anxiety had settled in my stomach, and I wondered how I would be able to eat. I can't go in, Mom, he answered quietly. Just pick something out for me. You know what I like. Anything will be fine. Okay, honey, I said, I'll be out soon. Within minutes, I was back in the car with 2 bags full of white styrofoam containers. Wow, that smells great, he said, surprising both of us. So we'll take the food back to the motel like we talked about, okay, honey, I said. Would you mind if we just ate in the car, Mom? You can eat in the trunk if you want, as long as you eat, I thought. To him, I said, sure, that's fine. There's a really pretty spot near campus where we can park the car, he suggested. This would have been a lovely idea in any other situation, but I sensed he was stalling. Okay, I'll drive there, but then you have to eat. We don't want the food to get cold. I will, I'll eat. It was only a short drive to a side street where there was a magnificent view overlooking the bay. A few people were sitting on benches, eating and enjoying the beauty. Want to get out, I asked. No thanks, I'd rather stay in the car, he answered. He'd been doing a lot of touching and tapping since I got the food, and now it was worse. I divvied up the plastic silverware and handed him his food. He was shaking and couldn't open his container. I pretended to be excited about my taco salad, hoping it would rub off on him. It didn't work. His container remained closed. Looking at him, unable to eat, I desperately wanted to understand. What on earth happened to my son? I know this is so hard for you, I said, but I'm going to have to make airline reservations for us to go home tomorrow. No, you don't have to do that. I'll eat later. No, Dan, there's no more later. You have to eat now. This is the time we agreed upon, and you need to eat now, or we'll have to go home. I took a deep breath and started my monologue again. You controlling your own actions, like eating, has no effect whatsoever on what happens in the world. You can't cause bad things to happen by eating. In fact, as I said before, it's just the opposite. I knew I was already sounding like a broken record, but I was hoping that hearing this continually would somehow be helpful. Besides, I had no idea what else to do. 45 minutes later, we were still sitting in the car. I'd been taking little bites of my food, but he still sat with the closed styrofoam container on his lap. It was heart-wrenching for me to see my son in this condition and not be able to help him. He finally spoke. I want to be alone when I eat. I'm going to sit on a bench. Of course, my first thought was that he'd unload his food on the first dog that walked by, so I said, okay, but I need to be able to see you from here. He took his food and got out of the car, walked toward the imaginary firing squad, hesitated, and then sat by himself on a bench. Even though I could only see him from the back, I could tell he was shaking badly. He stayed there, hunched over, trying to get himself to eat for almost an hour. I resigned myself that it just wasn't going to happen, got out of the car and walked toward him. Motion caught my eye. His fork was going from his food to his mouth in a mechanical, rhythmic way. I stopped and watched. Yes, it was true. Dan was eating. He was still shaking, and it looked like he was on automatic pilot, as if he couldn't think about or acknowledge what he was doing. But he was eating. Once he forced himself to take that first bite, each subsequent bite seemed to be a little easier. What a huge step. He did it. Maybe it would be possible for him to get through the semester after all. I walked back to the car and waited for him to finish. I'm so proud of you, I gushed when he returned. He seemed dazed, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. He got into the car and sat quietly for a minute before he spoke. Boy, that was really good. Guess I was kind of hungry. Though he made me smile, there was a strange disconnect between the levity of his words and the magnitude of the situation. I wasn't sure if he meant to be funny. Either way, it was okay. He'd eaten. I said, I have no idea what you're going through, but I know what you just did took a lot of courage and determination, and you should be very proud of yourself. Who knew watching my son eat a burrito could overwhelm me with such pride? So I'm pleased that my book is serving as a powerful tool to help me get the word out about OCD, because it's really a horrible disorder. And my goal from the beginning is the same goal that I have now, and that's really to spread the word that OCD, no matter how severe, is treatable, and that there's hope for all those that live with this disorder. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to.
A couple of questions. Are there any thoughts about what starts this? You know, why did it happen?
Right, excellent question. There are a lot of thoughts. There are no definitive answers. The kind of general consensus is it's a combination of genetics and environment. So a lot of people with OCD do have OCD in the family, either a close relative or maybe not so close relative. In our family, we don't know of anybody with OCD, but so many people have had it in the past and, you know, were never diagnosed, and, you know, certainly have our share of anxiety in the family. So there is, for most people in general, they say there is a genetic component. And then, you know, not everybody with the genetic component will develop OCD. It could be some kind of traumatic event, and, you know, trauma for one person might not be the same as trauma for another person. In our case, there was nothing really that we, you know, that we could pinpoint that really kind of got it started for Dan, and that is typical. Most people, many people with OCD will say that they've had it for as long as they remember. They just thought that that was how life was. So they remember even as a child being extremely anxious and having to do certain compulsions and that kind of thing. For Dan, it started later. So it's really unknown, and it's up until this past year, I think, when the new diagnostic, the DSM-5 came out, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that's kind of the Bible for psychologists. It was always classified as an anxiety disorder, but it's not anymore. It's now classified under the heading of obsessive compulsive and related disorders. So they've got kind of a range of these disorders, but there's definitely anxiety. I think it should be an anxiety disorder, but I'm not a therapist or a specialist.
How long did it take to develop? I mean, what you're reading about is obviously very, very severe.
Yes, yes. So in our case, what happened was our son diagnosed himself. So he told us when he was 17 that he had OCD, that he knew something was wrong for a few years, and he finally, you know, got to the point where he went on the internet and he figured out what it was. We had no clue, because contrary to popular belief, a lot of people with OCD have, as I talked about, the obsessions and the compulsions, but sometimes compulsions can be mental, so you don't see anything. So for example, he might have had an obsession that some harm would come to somebody in his family, and so the compulsion would be to count to 100. So you don't see anything. We don't, somebody on the outside doesn't see anything. So he told us that he had OCD because he wanted to get treatment before he went to college. And I think, so the problem was he was 1,500 miles from home and we weren't with him. We did actually visit him several times, but we weren't with him for long enough to see how bad things were getting. So while to us it did seem very quick, to become very severe very quick, I believe it was actually more gradual. We just weren't there to catch it, to see it. And he never told us how bad things were. So.
How did you find out about the therapy? I'd never heard of that.
By accident. So what and this is a very common story you hear a lot with those with the OCD. Our son diagnosed himself, so we took him to his pediatrician who knew him from birth, who sat with him for a few minutes and said, yes, he definitely has OCD, and then he just said he should see a therapist. So we went to the local therapist who all the kids liked, the one that all the teenagers in town used, and he told us his OCD was no big deal, and he would work with him. We had, I just figured, psychologists will know how to treat OCD. We never looked into any treatments or anything. Come to find out later that he was making him worse because he was sitting down trying to get to the bottom of the obsessions. Why do you think this way? Why do you feel this way? And the only answer for someone who has OCD is because I have OCD. It's not the talk therapy, the analysis does not help. It's this therapy. So in answer to your question, how we finally found out about it was through a series of events where it was recommended when he was this bad off that he go to a residential treatment program, which he did, and it was there that they used the ERP therapy. So it's amazing. Therapists should know about this, and we should have known about it. If he had gotten that therapy right away, then I think it's very unlikely he would have progressed to how severe it was.
It's a relatively new form of therapy, isn't it?
I think it was the late 60s, early 70s that it was developed, or early 60s maybe, but it was developed and it's been researched a lot, but it just doesn't seem to to get out in the mainstream. So it is just recently actually being kind of touted as the therapy of choice. It's recommended by the American Psychological Association as the therapy for OCD, but yes, I'd say relatively new.
How is it functioning now?
Thankfully, he's doing really well, and that's another reason why I was even prompted to write the book more, because we were lucky that we had a happy ending. So.
I'm not asking about compulsive behaviors, but in terms of therapeutic kinds of
Right.
things to make sure.
Yes, good ERP, one of the cornerstones of good ERP therapy is for the person with OCD to become his or her own therapist. So part of the therapy is teaching the person with OCD what to do, because OCD, for most people, doesn't go away. It can be mild, it can be in the background, you can go on living a wonderful life, but it never totally goes away. And so if you've got the tools to know what to do when you have a flare-up or when something is getting out of hand, and they say even when things are good, you should be practicing this ERP therapy. It's in a lot of ways what we all go through. We all have things that we avoid, that we don't like, or that we're afraid of. I hate elevators, but I force myself to go into an elevator. In a lot of ways, it's just facing your fears. And he had this therapy, and he, as far as we know, uses it when he needs to, and he's just been able to live a good life. He's 26 now, and he's doing very well. He's working in his field. He finished college. He's doing everything a young adult should do.
Can you talk a little bit about the genesis of the book's publication? Like, was it sort of like you sought out a publisher because you had sort of an idea for the story, or was it more like you had a blog and the publisher kind of found you? Like, I think that's something that's interesting for people.
Okay.
When they have an idea for a book.
Right.
It sounds like you really were moving in that direction, so you knew that you wanted to write a book. Sort of, how did the book come about?
Okay, that's a good question. Actually, I wrote the book. I wasn't looking for a publisher or anything. I knew, because no matter what happened, I wanted to get it down on paper. So the book was written, and then, as I said, I connected with Seth, and we put that other component into it. And then, basically, I started querying publishers myself. My blog, I think, was extremely helpful because I have a very sizable readership, and I have I write for a bunch of, the blog led to writing for other sites like Psych Central and mentalhealth.net. These are big mental health sites. So when you're querying a publisher, they want to see that you've got some exposure and that you can, that you've got a platform. Basically, that was my platform, was my blog. That helped quite a bit, I think. And I basically sent out lots of letters, and it was interesting because it started out, I started querying actually before I had the idea to add Seth into the book. And so I sent out letters, and I got a lot of no replies, and I got some replies that said, it's a good book, but there's so many memoirs on OCD, so we're not interested. And then I revised the book a little. I added, just kind of fine-tuned it, and the rejections got a little nicer. It's a good book, but it's not for us. And a few people said it's a good book, but you might want to think of they never said an expert, but just a hook or something a little different. And so it was in my head that I did need to do something different. And then when I connected with Seth, and I thought, of course, we just need some expert input. And shortly after the whole book was written and Seth did his part, shortly after that, we got our publisher, who's Roman and Littlefield, who does a lot of academic books as well. So I think the fact that we had the expert commentary was helpful in getting them to publish it. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, it was. How long did that process take for you? Was it like a year?
Oh.
Did it take many years?
It was many. I started writing the book when Dan was still going through everything. So from the time that I started writing the book, which was probably 2008-ish, to publication, which was 2015, was 7 years. Querying was probably a couple of years, on and off. So it was not you start out saying, okay, I'll send 3 letters. I'm sure somebody's going to, one of the 3 will want to publish my book. And I'm sure that happens to some people. It didn't happen to me. So it was also that feeling, it was a passion. And people say this too, if you want to have a book published. I would have done this for 20 years. I was just going to keep going until I did whatever I needed to do to get this book out there, because I believe that it's really important. So we just kind of kept plugging away at it.